Hello everyone, today we're reading comment on the Utopian military discipline from Thomas More's Utopia, published in 1516, also thanks to the help of Erasmus, by Thomas More, the 16th century English lawyer, philosopher, statesman, and writer, who is in fact best known for his work Utopia. Regarding Erasmus, that I made a video on already and commenting also on Cusano's work on that occasion, we have essentially opened a bit, it was years ago, so we haven't really resumed the topic very often, but it's always important to give a look at the theoretical, philosophical, and also politicological background of the Renaissance, and specifically about the political morality of war, and of course the employment of the military instrument in a broader civilizational sense, right? When it is right or wrong to fight and how, right? Which makes a bit the entire point here. Utopia, just giving a minimal background, as you know, is a fictional island society that More created as a way essentially to critique the social and political structures of England at the time. And he's the same work is actually quite controversial one, because More was Catholic, right, and a devout one, as a matter of fact, so that there are some aspects such as euthanasia, that there are, say, the general frame story is within the spectrum of monastic communitarism of some sort. So there is, in fact, a lot of utopistic, like liminal, truly asymptotic idea of what society should be per se. So there is a huge philological literary critique regarding this work, because in order to understand what he was exactly talking about, we don't even know exactly why he wrote this work in a broader historical, political context. In any case, this ideal society, More was a sort, of course, of an idealist regarding the world. There is no private property, not poverty, and not war. Even though, right, and this is the point of this video, war is contemplated by the Utopians practically along the pattern of the bellum justum of the Decretum Gratiani, right, and thus, contemplate even the possibility, for example, of colonial conquest wars, right, and etc., intervention in other countries' affairs. And this is why this is so fascinating, right, because while Erasmus, that was in contact with More, was mostly criticizing war, say the mystifying mechanisms of political power, right, and also the spiritual one that laid under at least the propaganda of the time concerning war, etc. The More's vision chose war, right, together with slavery, by the way, and religion, and this is very interesting because it makes it very traditional, as a matter of fact, to characterize the utopian customs, right? So he was just adapting to the canons in many ways, and so whereas Erasmus is a bit more chthonic and sarcastic in a broader sense, he's a bit of a stingy character, but also a very sort of sensitive one. More is sharper in a way, and more to the utopistic point, as a matter of fact, exactly to show how things are still possible to be done, because yes, utopia is a real utopia in many ways, right? Everything is well distributed in terms of wealth, citizens are conquered. There is a great satire the society of the time, says that the utopians don't have lawyers because they have law, right? entailing that they followed it rather than sort of toying with that to find sort of escape routes for profit, whatever, just in the way, of course, it was criticizing illegal activity. So the citizens of Utopia work for the common good and share everything equally. Again, this is not, say, a communistic utopia per se, right? The idea is according to tradition that, and remember, these are the years effectively of the Protestant Reformation, etc. So there is a huge debate regarding what constitutes the essence of true nobility, right? If you want, of moral, spiritual superiority. And of course, the same scriptures are, in a Christian context, are pretty clear about the fact that it's not that wealth is a negative thing per se, right? Nothing really is. But having a lot of it can potentially distract you from more important issues if you consider them the end, not a mean to a broader end, right? So we talked this also as far as the sacred royalty was concerned in tradition. The great ruler is definitely provided with great qualities that, given the success of their spiritual work, will have practical consequences in the world. But in this sense, not even physicality or wealth per se. Think about, in all the mythologies, the Olympians, the Aesir, etc. They are all actually smaller and less beast-like, in fact, also in size, etc., than their opponents, because they represent the materialistic world, the incarnated, that is the fallen one. And even though there is a perfection, of course, that exists in God, that gets less diluted among those who are, in fact, less fallen fundamentally. The entire debate regarding who is the righteous one and how does this, and the value of works, etc. It was an idea that, as you know, in the Renaissance, especially at this point, was being toyed with for a multiplicity of reasons that would give rise, in fact, to a lot of wars. Utopia is not really about war just per se, but obviously war constitutes essentially the second element of the Trinity, traditionally or Clausewitzianly, and therefore from the military customs of the Utopians you can understand a lot about this political philosophy that offers you a glimpse into of the, say, the mentality of the time, the Renaissance ethos, but also the continuity from the previous ones, and more again is essentially looking at a traditional concept for which, as we will see now, he makes the point that war, say, utopia, yes, is such a great utopia and whatever, but it's not really devoid of war just per se, or other forms of, for example, rule over other peoples, etc. And this obviously highlights a more realistic outlook of the author, that through, of course, a criticism in the way wars were waged at the time, however, tells us what, in fact, this should have been waged anyway, in a more sensible way, also in reality, right? So that's why I think this passage is interesting, because naturally we'll keep talking about this more moral issues in many other contexts, and the general attitude helps illustrating much broader beliefs that existed in the Renaissance, etc. There is, again, this sense also that utopians are not a militaristic society. Of course, this is also a religiously tolerant one, right? And you understand, if you know More's story, that we will briefly address now, has a great importance. It encourages religious diversity. Remember again that we are in the in a context in which, of course, different ideas were starting to be toyed with politically. Think about the Anglican Reformation, etc. So something that was saying, just consider that even if this thing happens at a point, we will still remain in belief that this should not be necessarily the right way, etc. So also predating lots of things that would have occurred later. Of course, there is an emphasis in the importance of classical literature and education that informs certain ethical and moral values expressed in the work, deriving from classical antiquity, as you can imagine, but in that sense, that more broader pool of tradition. Consider that More did write about past monarchs as well. He was a historian, among the other things, so it's interesting to consider in this perspective as well. Thomas More was also a devout Catholic, right? So that he would be later canonized as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. However, he was also known for his staunch opposition to the Protestant Reformation and his persecution of Protestants during his time as Lord Chancellor of England under Henry VIII, and More's refusal to acknowledge, in fact, Henry VIII as the head of the Church of England ultimately led to his execution in 1535. This aspect is crucial because it's obvious that the author was living just fully aware of the implications of such changes. So aside from the chronology, there is a considerable overlapping of, say, political issues, as we were saying before, concerning the world picture of the country in that case, but the broader religious beliefs in Europe as well. So we will not digress on that further, but the fact that he was beheaded by Henry VIII, and he is recognized by the same Anglican Church as a martyr of the Protestant Reformation, makes all this this view, say, regarding Catholic, imperial Catholic authority much more worthwhile, as it looks at a universal power and the necessity of a unity, which is something we've seen in the video about Erasmus as well, that basically criticizes heavily the fact that the unity of Christendom and of the world was being infringed on the basis of national identities, for example, that were deteriorating the collective welfare and essentially blinding people, essentially driving them away from the broader reason that is conquering the world unitarily, and not fragmenting and destroying the entire system, as it was practically happening at the time, for the enormous potential it would have had under a Catholic empire, which, as you understand, would have really made an enormous difference at the time. We'll surely keep discussing this at some point, especially with the new series I started about the Habsburgs. But for now, let's just read of the Utopian Military Discipline by Thomas More, who really writes this chapter fundamentally of his frame story to explain better how, in fact, the Utopians went at war and why and how. This is very fascinating. So he goes, they detest war as a very brutal thing. Right? This very statement, as we'll see now, is reminiscent of an Hellenic classical understanding of war in a sort of beast-like fashion that barbarians do, and so there is a way to rationally discipline it. And so in order, again, utopistically, to correct it, just hopefully without having to recur to war, right? Here, we don't digress. We know what the Romans oppositely believed, instead, that you could not eliminate a certain warlikeness and even individualism in order to collectively and rationally wage war in the first place. It would make a huge difference. In any case, More says, it assessed war as a very brutal thing in which the reproach of human nature is more practiced by men than by any sort of beasts. Right? So this is a paradox illustrating the fact that, in spite of the fact that, of course, animals live in a pretty brutal reality out on their own, men are the ones that are able to rationally wage war, and this is the first element of the Trinity in the first place, and that this, especially at the time, so a century that we mostly celebrate because we say, oh my god, the Renaissance, etc., and that was instead the single most traumatic in the history of Western civilization. This illness of wars was caused as a curse of war, also in previous centuries. By the way, of course, this was not new, but was felt in unprecedented fashion, given primarily the political fragmentation, and then war as just something that stemmed from that and seemed so systematic and generalized, to be seen now as incredible, right? In fact, beast-like, irrational, right? So I will not digress on how, say, reductive and simplistic this idea is, but both Erasmus and More make essentially an emotionalistic point of the same, right? The fact that war is just essentially a political instrument doesn't quite dawn on them. At least they were not expressing these ideas out than a sort of pietistic concept of, look, war is bad fundamentally, but we shouldn't go to beyond that, right? Except first the utopistic idea that they could always be settled that simply, right? And that, look, not even animals fight as much as we do, but animals also live in a much more miserable condition, as a matter of fact, and there is always something that you have to sacrifice if you want a better world, in a way, which doesn't mean that war is just the best solution to actually it's most cases not, right? But it still can be. However, it's very rapid, right? And we know what derives from that, even in terms of risk, etc. No doubt, but still, as an instrument of politics. Here, More says they. It's obviously always the utopians, right? So, not just to repeat it. They, in opposition to the sentiments of almost all other nations, think that there is nothing more inglorious than that glory is gained by war. Right? So they disdain the very fact of going to war, having to go to war in the first place. This also sounds very Hellenic, just in an idealistic sense, but not even in classical Greece things really went that way. And therefore, though they accustom themselves daily to military exercises and the discipline of war, and this is definitely not an Hellenic thing, at least not in the general sense, in which not only their men, but their women likewise are trained up, that in case of necessity they may not be quite useless, yet they do not rashly engage in war, unless it be either to defend themselves or their friends from any unjust aggressors, or out of good nature or in compassion assist an oppressed nation in shaking off the yoke of tyranny. Now this is where it gets really interesting, because let's leave aside the first element, that is to say, here you have a Western European basically saying, yes, you must exercise and discipline for war, also in peacetime, right? There is a daily training, as we see here, that is so collective in nature that not only men but also women participate in that. Again, More is a bit of a mystery as far as whichever extreme of, he says that even women could be priests. I mean, he was really known as a devout Catholic. So the work of Utopia is a provocative one of extreme that either he used just to, catch people's attention, to make it weirder, to make it sound more, wow, it's just as a futuristic thing. Things change, and they were seen at the time, for sure. And in which, say, the first thing would be thought was not really, about this this enormous, like, it will actually happen. This is obviously read mostly as an idea of, what is that this guy really wants to tell us. Here it doesn't even say how women would have been trained. In any case, they are ready for war in any circumstance, right? And the most interesting thing about the Utopians is that, albeit they do not, again, they don't have a liking at all of war, they don't rush into it, etc. They're always eager, first of all, to defend themselves, which sounds pretty obvious, but also their friends from any unjust aggressors. As I always say, isolationism is the first indicator of cultural inferiority, right? When the lesser people think that, basically the rest of the world does not exist, or they have to, surprise, make a sacrifice in order to make things work because they live in the world, and if they don't do that, they will end under somebody else. Well, you realize there that there is a deeply inferior culture that cannot afford to be a world power, cannot afford even to rule itself, let's be honest, and it should always be rejected as one of the lowest forms of human abomination that can ever create. There is no doubt that, in fact, in the world today, whichever boots on the ground policy is countered just per se, because it's boots on the ground, right? This speaks of the radical, again, I don't even know how to insult properly any person who thinks like this, that doesn't literally have the most elementary strategic and political notions of how a country is to be run in the first place. But the interesting thing here is that, and that's why I also chose this chapter, is that, of course, the Utopians are always eager to intervene in favor of friends that are unjustly aggressed, right? So this is, again, aside from the contextualization of an English author in that period, etc., this sense is pretty clear. The world is open, right? The Utopians are not a bunch of fourth estate or paranoid, glued to their screens in the 21st centuries. They're actually intelligent people provided with actual human dignity. And as such, they obviously think that the first thing that happens when a friend is unjustly aggressed is to intervene, right? And not only that, but also out of good nature or in compassion to assist an oppressed nation in shaking off the yoke of a tyranny. This has obviously transfiguring, redeeming, qualities. There is a spiritual mission there. What is fascinating about this, as I was saying before, is that, again, if this had been a real utopia, utopians would have controlled the entire world, and they would have simply not needed to fight any war because everything was perfect, right? It's just like von Clausewitz's metaphysical concept of absolute warfare. That has nothing to do with total war or whatever, cerebrally dysfunctional people fundamentally always think that von Clausewitz was talking about at the time, including the National Socialists that, of course, lost in a clamorous, as inappealable way their war. But for that matter, and there is a reason, of course, here we see the most obvious realization that a country worth of this name is always to be ready to go out there and kick somebody's ass when the world is in trouble, right? And because it's just the right thing to do, right? Erasmus there essentially shitting on the various nations that said, I hate you because, you're a different nation from mine, and so I just have to fight for this nation, even though they don't even know what it is, right? As they are emotionalistically dominated individuals, typical of the modern age of anti-tradition and of the imperial Catholic one especially. That means specifically ecumenic and universal, for that matter, are perfectly convinced that there is a objective standard. There is no such thing that there is moral relativism. They don't whine about, but it's my country that has to suffer the burden of this wars, because as Hugh explains now, we'll read it, what happens in the world is felt to, especially against the France, so with whomever they do share these values, of course eager to observe that if it goes bad for them, it will go bad for the utopians at the same time, right? And in fact, and this is the most obvious intelligent thing, among the others, telling the truth, is that utopians, continuing to read, indeed help their friends not only in defensive, but also in offensive wars. Right? So they don't actually distinguish this entire BS, again, that fourth estate or populistic, paranoid, mentally challenged individuals think that if you just defend, you're a good person, right? Instead, offending somebody else is bad, just per se. Why? You may have all the reasons to offend someone. Right, Vuis did it through this thing. I mean, it's basic logic. I think even a child understands this very simple. At least as a child, I understood them very clearly. Why does an actual adult person today can't have things like civic rights, children, or driving a car or whatever, if it doesn't understand this very simple notion? Right, it's pure reason, objectivity, scientific culture. There is no strange idea. If this is what essentially the connection between politics and war is seen like, and not seen like actually, what's the entire point of being a citizen whatsoever? You can be just like an animal in some dirty, place, I don't know, but not surely a person living together with other actual people in a civilized country. You cannot afford that if you think otherwise. And I think that the world today should start discriminating very heavily, violently and rigidly about this, because it's not possible to continue to live in communities where actually everybody has the same rights, and literally they don't even know what this actually is. Like the majority of the population doesn't even understand the basics of the superiority of Western civilization. This is very disturbing to me. In the deepest imperial traditional Catholic meaning of the sole possible identity that a man has in front of God to have in the first place. This is extremely disturbing. Of course, there must be a rational element, and this is the point of this all. In fact, Moore writes, the utopians never do that unless they had been consulted before the breach was made, and being satisfied with the grounds on which they went, they had found that all the demands of reparation were rejected, so that the war was unavoidable. In other words, if somebody basically causes a damage and it's not repaid, and of course the entire picture is, this thing can't keep happening, you have to smash this person's teeth, right? So that the person will not do that afterwards. And it is a very intelligent idea in the first place. The entire concept of deterrence. That's the reason why we have a military. That's the reason why when you say that if you do something, I will bomb the shit out of you, and you actually follow up with that if that happens, it's not just a right thing, but it's holy. It's done righteously in the name of God. Not the God of the lesser people, but actual God. And this is the most important thing of all. This, they think, the utopians, to be not only just when one neighbor makes an inroad on another by public order and carries away the spoils, but when the merchants of one country are oppressed in another, for example, either under pretense of some unjust laws or by the perverse wresting of good ones, right? They, of course, are looking at a broader system of network, right, that can be at least extended as far as the rights of these people are on the basis of their objective quality, right? Because, of course, these are the utopians, they're not others, right? And the utopians discount as a juster cause of war than the other, because those injuries are done under some color of laws. This was only the only ground of that war in which they engaged with the Nephologites against the Ilopolitanes a little before our time. For the merchants of the former having, as they thought, met with great injustice among the latter, which, whether it was in itself right or wrong, drew on a terrible war in which many of their neighbors were engaged, in their keenness in carrying it on being supported by their strength in maintaining it, it not only shook some very flourishing states and very much afflicted others, but after a series of much mischief, ended in the entire conquest and slavery of the Ilopolitanes, who, though before the war they were in all respects much superior to the Nephologites, were yet subdued. But though the Utopians had assisted them in the war, they pretended to no share of the spoil. This passage is also brutally important for one simple reason. More wants to highlight essentially how fair the Utopians were, so that they began to assist an ally that will ultimately lose, and they will not, however, want to take advantage of it either, because they're, again, so fair that they didn't go at war, nor because they wanted, of course, they wanted to win it, but they were not necessarily, because this is realistic, sure they would, right? But they knew it was the right thing to do, also because this presumably would damage them, as otherwise we wouldn't be an ally of any sort. And again, there is a deeper reason here, a cultural one, even whoever Utopia lies itself with. And also not, of course, with any even interest in profit, generally speaking. Right, in profit stemming from the spoils of war of whomever, but just first and foremost, the necessity of supporting this ally. Right. The fascinating thing here is, of course, the concept that you have to help an ally, just because of that. Right. It is true. We've seen it in the Frankrieg that a country that cannot defend itself, cannot even receive support from any ally, right? Von Clausewitz explains this when he talks about the partition of Poland. And he says, in that circumstance, actually others will more... Of course, Machiavelli, von Clausewitz would have reasoned in a bit of a different way regarding especially this thing of not sharing the spoils, etc., depending on, of course, the more fluid reality of the situation would be. But the sense here that you have to take from it is that, of course, you fight wars because wars can be won or lost in the first place, and there is no way to know that until you fight them, right? And until they actually end in a decisive manner. So, aside from the connection that can be with politics, meaning that, of course, again, war is an instrument of the former, and so you may have any other reason for bailing out at some point or not, right? The point is, if you have a broader, say, purpose for which you are as a superior, this is the actual discriminant, if you are a morally superior country, and you have, of course, the most obvious interest of protecting another one that is aggressed, and that maybe in dire straits, right? But still, it's your ally. You have to support it. Let alone when the ally can actually defend himself and actually can work the thing out. And as we've seen, the and now better more will explain. This has to do with the general benefit, of course, that that alliance meant in the first place, that people again seem to have forgotten, right? That politics is not about how much you have to pay, but what you want to do in the first place. This is what Moore is saying quite clearly, right? Cost-benefit ratios are, of course, at a higher level, the most important deliberation to make when engaging yourself in a war. But in that sense, it's highly unlikely for any war to be ever fought. I can't think of one historically if there wasn't, a specific reason, right, to get into it, which may have been a bad one or a good one in a broader civilizational sense. So that normally culturally underdeveloped peoples are crushed more often than not, just because they are simply not enough, nor they can afford to be one. But they can be more desperate, and so doing something that for a civilized country is definitely bad, and that is actually stupid in terms of the risk they're taking on the shorter, medium run. But maybe it's the last resort to even survive as a people, but because they suck as a people. Right, which is what we're seeing essentially with countries like China or Russia today, right? Basically, entire global civilization is sinking, contracting dramatically. These systems do not work, and they attempt the most stupid things, apparently, because they have their own logic, but it's not a logic of, of genially crafted, and sorted out plan. It's just, if we want to keep on being shit fundamentally like this, we have to at least try this and do so. So if from the other side you're so stupid that you don't see that, of course, you are the superior civilization and you can easily crush them as flies if you just start being less spoiled and undereducated and lazy and fat and all the rest, well, maybe you will have some right to keep on having the utmost God-given privilege to rule the world, and not just being the average fourth estate or moron that will just become ever more stupid and ever poorer and faster than all the others if you are in that group, just because you literally don't have the basic ABC of what it is: international politics, strategy, deterrence. And you think you can study military history by, simply watching one YouTube video, but not really studying even what this actually says, right? Which is quite disturbing, in my opinion. But just as a friendly reminder. Then Moore goes on and says, but though they so vigorously assist their friends in obtaining reparation for the injuries they have received in affairs of this nature, yet if any such frauds were committed against themselves, provided no violence was done to their persons, they would only, on their being refused satisfaction, forbear trading with such people. Here a line is drawn as far as there is no actual bloodshed per se, right? If basically somebody infringes this code of free trade and some of their allies suffers for this, at best what they will do is that they will stop trading with these other guys. This situation can get, however, negative when one of their own Utopians is, say, killed somewhere, and at that point the thing becomes pretty serious, pretty substantial. So if there is no punishment of those who have committed this crime, they are going basically to declare war, right? And the thing is considered at that point worth it, right? Even for that few, which is again, it's not necessarily realistic as an idea, but still the idea that, I don't know, you kill one of my citizens, I will blow to hell 100 of yours, well, sounds maybe, depending, of course, who these guys are, even demographically speaking, and how worth they are, because as we will see now, there is also an acceptation of slavery for that matter, in the process of these heinous crimes, is a sensible choice, I would say. In fact, the thing goes on, I predicted a little bit here, but it says, this is not because they consider their neighbors more than their own citizens, but since their neighbors trade every one upon his own stock, fraud is a more sensible injury to them than it is to the Utopians. All right? Among whom the public in such a case only suffers. They expect nothing in return for the merchandise they export, but that in which they so much abound and is of little use to them. The loss does not much affect them. So, of course, here the Utopians are a bit also the rich guys, because they are so virtuous, etc. So here it means that works work, by the way, also in the world of Utopia, and especially there. And the sense is that, it's not enough to go to war just for some sort of trade boycott per se, right? At least especially the one carried out against the Allies. They think, therefore, it would be too severe to revenge a loss attended with so little inconvenience, either to their lives or their subsistence with the death of many persons. But if any of their people are either killed or wounded wrongfully, whether it be done by public authority or only by private men, as soon as they hear it, they send ambassadors and demand that the guilty persons may be delivered up to them, and if that is denied, they declare war. But if it be complied with, the offenders are condemned either to death or slavery. And this is again fascinating, because this is looking at already at the beginning of the 16th century a very high sense. I guess this stuff existed also in the Middle Ages. There were specific rights, sanctions for merchants abroad during all the kind of wars that existed at the same time. The economy had to keep on going, of course, in many ways, and you can imagine how often these issues had aroused. But the question had arisen, but already how highly a country could believe of itself and his citizens, in order to feel that war, just for the killing of some of them, was fundamentally justified on a regular basis, right? And or slavery, interestingly enough. So this was this could evidently set the preconditions for even invading those lands in the first place. And it is quite fascinating, because it's a sort of moral superiority that is basically fueled by the right of the superior, in fact, to rule over the weaker and the wicked, which actually makes a lot of sense, and it was the traditional deal of why, of course, there is nothing bad in having an empire, just per se. More says, they would be both troubled and ashamed of a bloody victory over their enemies, and think it would be as foolish a purchase as to buy the most valuable goods at too high a rate. And in no victory, so again, the cost-benefit ratio definitely is there. Here it says that, of course, the Utopians want to consider how much they're going to spend for that war as well. And in no victory do they glory so much as in that which is gained by dexterity and good conduct without bloodshed, which is, of course, meant politically, because otherwise, unless it's a war without bloodshed, at least from the side of the Utopians, that would be good, right? But it's not quite concretely a thing. So, of course, here there is a moral principle that is also universal. That is to say, if everybody follows reason, right, automatically things will get in order. But as we know, the world is not a utopia, right? So this is not much about the fact of calculating how much blood you will spill, but also calculating, broadly speaking, what effect that is going to have, which is not necessarily and always the most negative one, depending on the circumstance, in absolute terms. In such cases, they appoint public triumphs and erect trophies to the honor of those who have succeeded, right? People obviously often mistake bloodshed just for sin, just per se. It's not, let's say, a matter of even the biblical commandment is against murder, not killing, right? Translated correctly from the original language, because the difference is immense, right? So bloodshed is a sin, right? Because you put an end to somebody else's life, but there cannot be any victory without a sacrifice. And if that cost is commensurate to the actual effort, right, to the actual result, to what you could concretely gain from that, then, right, the utopians would celebrate this war and this victory, as a matter of fact, so that this will see that the people will be honored, the generals will be rewarded. For then do they reckon that a man acts suitable to his nature when he conquers his enemy in such a way as that no other creature but a man could be capable of, and that is by the strength of his understanding. Bears, lions, boars, wolves, and dogs, and all other animals employ their bodily force one against another, in which as many of them are superior to man, both in strength and fierceness, so they are all subdued by his reason and understanding. And this is also, in fact, a traditional principle. You can't have somebody that wants to attack you, but if you're smarter fundamentally and you prevent, you know how to use deterrence, and you know how to settle questions with that force that stands in your spirit, which doesn't mean to back down, not to be violent in the first place, then you have a much greater glory, and you can't keep these beasts at bay, right? Just which you may have to kill at some point, but still, that's not the only way, right? There is always, at least in theory, a way to make it best, right? Just not leaving them any choice, by the way, and seeing their own destruction, by the way, and convincing them to back down. The only design of the utopians in war is to obtain that by force which, if it had been granted then in time, would have prevented war. Or, if that cannot be done, to take so severe a revenge on those that have injured them, that they may be terrified from doing the like for the time to come. So in other words, you should always intervene in a way that is commensurate to the situation, and if the measure is definitely a great offense, you must destroy this guy so that basically they will never try that again, right? Which definitely doesn't happen with caresses, etc. By these ends, they measure all their designs and manage them so that it is visible that the appetite of fame or vainglory does not work so much on there as a just care of their own security, right? As soon as they declare war, they take care to have a great many skettles that are sealed with their common seal, affixed in the most conspicuous places of their enemy's country. There are spies, there are people traveling. It's not an isolated world. Evidently, this is carried secretly and done in many places all at once. So this stresses the unity of intent and this intelligence capacity, definitely. In this they promise great rewards to such as shall kill the prince, and lesser in proportion to such as shall kill any other person, were those on whom, next to the prince himself, they cast the chief balance of the war. Right? And they double the sum to him that, instead of killing the person so marked out, shall take him alive and put him in their hands. Right? This is quite interesting because, of course, you can essentially capture or take out, in general, the enemy chiefs, so to deprive them of their own leadership, of their own insight, their own, and also at some point at least demoralizing the community that has supported them up to that point, showing, of course, that they were not so capable as they thought would be. It's also psychological warfare in many ways, propaganda, etc. They offer not only indemnity but rewards to such of the persons themselves that are so marked if they will act against their countrymen, right? So turning them against one another. By this means, those that are named in their schedules become not only distrustful of their fellow citizens, but are jealous of one another, and are much distracted by fear and danger. For it has often fallen out that many of them, and even the prince himself, have been betrayed by those in whom they have trusted most. For the rewards that the Utopians offer are so immeasurably great that there is no sort of crime to which men cannot be drawn by them. They consider the risk that those run will undertake such services, and offer a recompense proportion to the danger, not only a vast deal of gold, but great revenues in lands that lie among other nations that are their friends, right? Where they may go and enjoy them very securely. Which is also fascinating because the Utopians evidently have enough authority over their friends just to settle there some scumbags that would kill their own people, but just for the right cause, and essentially redeeming them, just transforming them, but still with this promise that is quite materialistic at the end of the day. So this is perhaps a bit of a slippery slope. In any case, they observe the promises they make of their kind most religiously, right? Because oaths are important indeed. And also because the reward must be credible, right? They very much approve of this way of corrupting their enemies, though it appears to others to be base and cruel, but they look on it as a wise course to make an end of what would be otherwise a long war without so much as hazarding one battle to decide it. This is pretty Machiavellian, but in fact it does make sense. It's ruthless but irrational, right? And so if the ultimate end is to... It's a Clausewitzian concept as well. You know, there is... say you have to be more effective as possible, and so only at that point, right, you can avoid further bloodshed. They think it likewise an act of mercy and love to mankind to prevent, in fact, the great slaughter of those that must otherwise be killed in the progress of the war, both on their own side and on that of their enemies, by the death of a few that are most guilty. And that in so doing they are kind even to their enemies, and pity them no less than in their own people, as knowing that the greater part of them do not engage in the war of their own accord, but are driven into it by the passions of their prince. This is also fascinating because it buys a bit into that notion that people are somehow just innocent, right? It's all about the leaders that are evil and they have no responsibility. This is highly inaccurate, right? But it is true that the mechanism through which it happens is really one of, let's say, of in fact fear, of intimidation. So rather the weakness, the moral inferiority of these people, and not much the fact that they would otherwise alone act like that. So they actually are responsible because they let it happen, and this is the entire point, that wherever you come from, you are responsible for whatever is happening. This is valid for the entirety of the world, as a matter of fact. And therefore you cannot complain when bad things happen. But if you are that weak that you simply go follow the trail like a dog to whoever tells you to do that, including going get yourself killed and killing others, then if, killing the guy at the top helps such a scumbag like you not to do it, well, that's, of course, a moral thread that you must follow as a utopian, right, to induce at least in your enemies. So if this method does not succeed with them, then they sow seeds of contention among their enemies and animate the prince's brother or some of the nobility Here, of course, we're talking in a context in which pretty much everyone was ruled by a monarch. In Europe, we will see now the exception because, in fact, More compares the Utopians to the Swiss, right? So it's an interesting take on that. And I made plenty of videos about the Swiss Confederates, so that's something we can also deepen in the future. So More goes on and says, if this method does not succeed with them, or some nobility to aspire to the crown, if they cannot disunite them by domestic broils, and they engage their neighbors against them, and make them set on foot some old pretensions, which are never wanting to princes when they have an occasion for them, these they plentifully supply with money, though but very sparingly with any auxiliary troops, for they are so tender of their own people that they would not willingly exchange one of them, even with the prince of their enemy's country. Right. But as they keep their gold and silver only for such an occasion, so, when that offers itself, they easily part with it, since it would be no convenience to them, though they should reserve nothing of it to themselves. For besides the wealth that they have among them alone, they have a vast treasure abroad, many nations round about them being deep in their debt. This is another fascinating aspect, that there is again a worth in wealth itself when it gets to earthly issues. This is a very Catholic idea, at least as far as the empire follows as well. So that they hire soldiers from all places for carrying on their wars, right? So this is fascinating because, and it does make a lot of sense. Here, surely, More was thinking of the Romans in many ways, that had as actually more auxiliaries than legionnaires, but the legionnaires were like still the top notch. So it's not that if you just make others make war, you don't have to have a military. And so, of course, being that well prepared in any circumstance is great. But it's say if you are great as a civilization that much, and that everybody is indebted with you as a consequence, among other things, you can send these people to go fight somewhere else. And this in general happens, as we've seen, within the same countries, meaning that, as we've seen in the same England, I don't know, the Celtic Fringe, Wales, etc., would provide with large amounts of mercenaries, right? Because you can argue that in that sense the Welsh had indebted themselves to the English in a broader sense, and as poor as they were more likely to enlist, say, in the army, mercenary company, and so on. It says, but chiefly from the Zapolites, these are other, peoples of the world of Utopia, who live 500 miles east of Utopia. Of course, Utopia can be seen at this with this geographical references as Britain, right? In any case, this is the point. In fact, they're described, could easily be the Scandinavians. It says, they are rude, wild, and fierce nation who delight in the woods and rocks among which they were born and bred up. Right, they are ardent both against heat, cold, and labor, and know nothing of the delicacies of life. Well, it's a bit stereotypical, that not necessarily about Scandinavia. They're hardened also against heat, at least. They're savages anyway. They do not apply themselves to agriculture, nor they care either for the houses of their clothes. Cattle is all that they look after, and for the greatest part they live either by hunting or upon rapine, and are made as if it were only for war. Right. So this is the say stereotype of a broader, primitive, warlike, pastoral people. Right. That of course was more just warlike historically, and capable of providing with these forces. They watch all opportunities of engaging in it, and very readily embrace such as are offered them. Great numbers of them will frequently go out and offer themselves for a very low pay to serve any that will employ them. They know none of the arts of life, but upon such terms that the next day they may go over to the enemies of those who they serve if they offer them a greater encouragement, and will perhaps return to them the day after that upon a higher advance of their pay. That was, as we've seen, why this was so important. There are few wars in which they make not a considerable part of the armies of both sides, so it often falls out that they who are related and were hired in the same country and so have lived long and familiarly together, forgetting both their relations and former friendship, kill one another upon no other consideration than that of being hired to it for little money by princes of different interests. In such a regard have they for money that they are easily brought on by the difference of 1 penny a day to change sides. This could be a stereotype of the Irish now that I think about that. So entirely does their avarice influence them, and yet this money which they value so highly is of little use to them, for what they purchase thus with their blood they quickly waste on luxury, which among them is but of a poor and miserable form. Alright. So again, this is just the stereotype of the barbarian rather than else, and this draws definitely from also a sort of generic, standard, basic, classical stereotype of the barbarian. But it's accurate at the same time, meaning the sense that this is how ancient tribes literally believed and behaved like is still quite relevant. This nation serves the Utopians against all people whatsoever, for they pay higher than any other. The Utopians hold this for a maxim, as they seek out the best sort of men for their own use at home, so they make use of this worst sort of men for the consumption of war, and therefore they hire them with the offers of vast rewards to expose themselves to all sort of hazards, out of which the greater part never returns to claim their promises, yet they make them good most religiously to such as escape. This is also fascinating because it's a bit too preserving as a mindset. Like, the idea is that you always have to have at least advisors, etc., on war zones, etc., so to know more or less what is going on. Also, this fact of simply sending foreigners at war in your stead is not really realistic in the general sense. It is true that, for example, the French hired the Swiss that would come back home, that wouldn't represent much of a threat even internally, socially, as veterans that could rise up, etc., after they were discharged. So there is here a sense that everybody's equal, everybody is at least in worth, right? So, and of course the Utopians are better than the other people, so in general they don't want to, let's say, to lose some of their elements, because they consider them as better than the others. But at the same time, here you can train for war, but there's still an experience that you can get only there. Here at least more doesn't seem to get that at this point. He goes on and says, this animates them to adventure again whenever there is occasion for it, for the Utopians are not at all troubled how many of these happen to be killed, right? So a very pragmatic, cold choice, and reckon it as service done to mankind if they could be a means to deliver the world from such a lewd and vicious sort of people. That is to say, not just these people are not utopian, so who cares about them, but since they are culturally underdeveloped, we can't do without them. And actually this sounds a good idea if it wasn't for the fact that such people can be warlike, but say due to their barbarism, but up to some point, because let's say, I don't know, in the 16th century, if you pick the savages from the Americas, well, these are not really going to be particularly useful soldiers in a Western context, like this one. So, of course, there are more warlike peoples like I don't know, in some different areas of Europe, as it had always kind of been the case. And you can say, well, it's better for them simply to die, and given that they're so used to it, they like it, you don't even have sort of remorse towards them. That seem to have run together as the drain of human nature. Next to these, they are served in their wars with those upon whose account they undertake them, and with the auxiliary troops of their own friends, to whom they join a few of their own people, and send some men of eminent and approved virtue to command in chief. There are 2 sent with him, who during his command are but private men, but the first is to succeed him if he should happen to be either killed or taken, and in case of the like misfortune to him, the third comes in his place, and thus they provide against all events that such accidents as may befall their generals may not endanger their armies. So this is also pretty naive conceptually to minimize your own connationals to the point to be sent to war, to the point that just the commander basically is there. And but of course this is again a utopistic reality in which you may think that if the state works so well, these commanders will have this experience that will train effectively in case of need your troops at home, say if you're invaded, and or if you are forced to intervene with your own troops rather than these with these barbarians that you use just as auxiliary troops and cannon fodder, basically. Now, when they draw out troops of their own people, this is the interesting part, they take such out of every city as freely offer themselves, right? So volunteers, for none are forced to go against their wills, since they think that if any man is pressed that wants courage, he will not only act faintly, but by his cowardice dishearten others. This is fascinating, not just because of, what would be the English proclivity to volunteer armies later on in the modern age, with a few significant exceptions, right? In Napoleonic wars, the world wars, but also because in the 16th century you had an army of this kind that was the Spanish one, as the tercios were all volunteers, at least ideally, and the sense was exactly what Morris is talking about here. That is to say, if there was allegedly no discipline, because the only idea of leaving the tercio was so dishonorable that it would have not been acceptable and or would have basically marked you for life. Here could be interesting to think whether it was some connection maybe between, think about the Spanish marriage of Henry VIII, but let's say the sense that maybe More was thinking again about another people here in particular could have been the case. Then he goes on and says, but if an invasion is made on their country, they make use of such men if they have good bodies, though they are not brave. So if you are invaded, at least you're pushed, you're pressed into combat on the basis of your physical capacity, even though you may be a coward, and either put them aboard their ships or place them on the walls of their towns, that being so posted they may find no opportunity of flying away. Mm-hmm. And thus either shame, the heat of action, or the impossibility of flying bears down their cowardice, which here works mostly as a sort of militia, rather. They often make a virtue of necessity, and behave themselves well because nothing else is left them. But as they force no man to go into any foreign war against his will, so they do not hinder those women who are willing to go along with their husbands. On the contrary, they encourage and praise them, and they stand often next to their husbands in the front of the army. This is also a bit sort of Germanistic, like about the Cimbrians, the Teutons. And actually in Germany at the time we've seen that the whore train, right? because this was also a reality of the thing, was in the life of the soldier, of the mercenaries, quite a thing. I mean, there were prostitutes as much. There were actually very, very honest women there. But the sense that, again, this is a sort of broader family enterprise of utopia that adds a bit to the sense that women here would also go with their next to their husbands in the front of the army. As we've seen, the women were apparently trained, and they also placed together those who are related, parents and children, kindred, and those that are mutually allied near one another. This sort of sounds like more a tribal clanic army rather than, of course, a Renaissance one. So again, more is definitely drawing stuff from, the Greeks, the Romans, the Germans of ancient times, right? That those whom nature has inspired with the greatest zeal for assisting one another may be the nearest and readiest to do it. And it is matter of great reproach if the husband or wife survive one another, or if a child survives his parent, and therefore when they come to be engaged in action, they continue to fight to the last man if their enemies stand before them. Then this is terrifying. This is beyond Stalinism, but as we've seen, at least they were not forced here. They're all volunteers, ideally, and they join into this sort of again, we all fight together because we're all the nucleus of family, and we will stick together till the end. Except this is not actually how this happens in real life, and the tighter bond is formed only under arms, with a rigid collective discipline, not the sort of, again, children, women. It's of course here. Of course, there are female soldiers that carry out their job beautifully, etc. But the sense that, again, the individual can be driven solely by familial ties, as far as it's practically the objective to slaughter great parts of people in front of you, is not actually how it happens, right? Not even the story that if you're an orphan, you allegedly are the ones who kills, next to psychopaths, by the way, as recipients of the greatest decorations in combat. At best, you can get yourself killed much more easily, right? But in order to be a soldier that knows how to do that professionally, well, there's a great distance, and here, fundamentally, Moore doesn't address the topic, and it is all very weird objectively, because it's an utopia, there is no doubt, but there should be a bit more to it, especially considering this sort of good premise about the utopian influence abroad, right? That should be, say, substantiated by sort of professional military. Volunteers can do this evidently, but as we've seen, utopians do not like to go to war, at least to see their blood shed, right? So this is also something that, as far as combatism, veterans, etc. are concerned, they prefer to send just some savage people trained, we do not know exactly how, for fighting their wars. Doesn't sound quite realistic. Anyway, Moore is a sort of ethereal idealist of some kind, but it's just was toying with his ideas in a utopistic world, in fact. So there is a traditional meaning, as far as, of course, as the sense of the familiar nucleus, spiritual strength, right? That is to say, ancient warriors had, would have, of course, to die rather than fleeing. Otherwise, it would be dead in front of their families, literally, and their women also would die. Just they would throw themselves on this world at the death of their husband. It's a traditional thing, but the specialized roles in combat were in society as such were also very different. So it's not really how it really happened. child parent, so we read this, they're standing for them, and as they use all prudent methods to avoid the endangering their own men, and if it is possible to let all the action and danger fall upon the troops that they hire, so if it becomes necessary for themselves to engage, they then charge with as much courage as they avoided it before with prudence. Nor is it a fierce charge at first, but it increases by degrees, and as they continue in action, they grow more obstinate and press harder upon the enemy, inasmuch as they will much sooner die than give ground. This is also somehow weird, because even just from a strategical point of view, the most important thing is to give that damn blow that's strongly and not increasing later, also because that's not really how it happens, especially when a unit is engaged in combat. It gives the best at the beginning, then gradually can hold out for long, becoming even fanatic in defense, but surely not increasing pressure. But here, in fact, these guys look like Superman of some sort, and also the sense of increase, it doesn't sound quite realistic as an actual military understanding from more in general. Crowned for these, the certainty that their children will be well looked after when they are dead frees them from all that anxiety concerning them which often masters men of great courage, and thus they are animated by a noble and invincible resolution, which is, yet again, not how it works, especially if you're not properly a military profession, if you don't have by default this substantial collective military experience. And why would you risk your family, by the way, altogether? Like, if you really care about them, you don't bring them on the battlefield in the first place, unless you're very politically committed, so that your presence there is crucial. But these are average utopians, so why would you do that? In any case, their skill in military affairs increases their courage, and the wise sentiments which, according to the laws of their country, are instilled into them in their education, give additional vigor to their minds, for as they do not undervalue life so as prodigally to throw it away, they are not so indecently fond of it as to preserve it by base and unbecoming methods. In the greatest heat of action, the bravest of their youth, who have devoted themselves to that service, single out the general of their enemies, set on him either openly or by ambuscade, pursue him everywhere, and when spent and wearied out, are relieved by others who never give over the pursuit, either attacking him with close weapons when they can't get near him, or with those which wound at a distance when others get in between them. So that, unless he secures himself by flight, they seldom fail at last to kill or to take him prisoner. When they have obtained a victory, they kill as few as possible, and are much more bent on taking many prisoners than on killing those that fly before them. Nor do they ever let their men so loose in the pursuit of their enemies as not to retain an entire body still in order, so that if they have been forced to engage the last of their battalions before they could gain the day, they will rather let their enemies all escape than pursue them when their own army is in disorder, remembering well what has often fallen out to themselves, that when the main body of their army is being quite defeated and broken, when their enemies, imagining victory obtained, have let themselves loose into an irregular pursuit, a few of them that lay for a reserve, waiting a fit opportunity, have fallen on them in their case, and when straggling in disorder and apprehensive of no danger, but counting on the day in Rome, have turned the world action, and wresting out of their hands a victory that seemed certain and undoubted, while the vanquished have suddenly become victorious. This is actually spot on instead, because it talks about the role of reserves, as we've seen in von Clausewitz quite abundantly, and it is true, right? Except it's it takes also a bit of mastery to, say, make the bulk of your army collapse, and why would you risk that just for an ambush in any case, and not use those forces in the same heat of action? That's not really how it works in general, right? So reserves hidden parties, things like this do exist and are useful, but they're just, especially when an entire army is broken, not really unless it's a very chaotic situation in which in fact also the enemy is that disordered and broken, right, when some things can happen, but it's not normally how armies really work for that matter. In general, it is hard to tell, continuing more, whether they are more dexterous in laying or avoiding ambushes. Right? They sometimes seem to fly when it is far from their thoughts, and when they intend to give ground, they do it so that it is very hard to find out their design. Now, ambushing or eluding an ambush is not really a proof of strategic strength in the first place, right? If you are like the dominant army, you just smash the enemy in the face, and that's the absolute strategic principle that you should strive for, being very strong at the moment. So saying, now I will make an ambush, or now I will, elude, the enemy ambush, is that frequent as rarely, right? So you may be finding yourself, of course, in the capacity of avoiding an ambush, but not because you're just particularly just open for it. And if you are trying to ambush an enemy as well, the question is, especially in large forces, is the enemy dumb? So here they're kind of sort of Superman in action, but never mind. If they see that they are ill-posted or are like to be overpowered by numbers, they then either march off the night with great silence or by some stratagem delude their enemies. If they retire in the daytime, they do it in such order that it's no less dangerous to fall upon them in a retreat than in a march. Right? They fortify their camps with a deep and large trench and throw out the earth that is dug out of it for a wall. Nor do they employ only their slaves in this, but the whole army works at it. Interesting thing here. Slavery is considered on a regular basis. And except those that are then upon the guard, so that when so many hands are at work, a great line and strong fortification is finished in so short a time it is scarce credible. Right. So this is a bit like the description of the Roman army camp construction. Their armor is very strong for defense, and yet is not so heavy as to make them uneasy in their marches. They can have everything right here. They can even swim with it. And all that are trained up to war practice swimming. This I like, because I practiced swimming for 12 years and more, so that the thing I like, but it's not really also a particularly useful, practical, or real thing here. 16th century warfare. Both horse and foot make great use of arrows and are very expert. Which at the beginning of the 16th century, admittedly, was an English thing. The longbow would become, like with the crossbow, obsolete, or at least very antiquate, only by the mid-16th century. They have no swords, but fight with a pole axe that is both sharp and heavy, but which they thrust or strike down an enemy. They are very good at finding out warlike machines and disguise them so well that the enemy does not perceive them till he feels the use of them, so that he cannot prepare such a defense as would render them useless. The chief consideration had in making them is that they may be easily carried and managed. Yes, this is really the world of Utopia, having all the advantages without all the disadvantages, right? If they agree to a truce, they observe it so religiously that no provocations will make them break it. They never lay their enemies' country waste, nor burn their corn, and even in their marches they take all possible care that neither horse nor foot may tread it down, right? For they do not know but that they may have use for it themselves. They hurt no man whom they find disarmed, unless he's a spy. When a town is surrendered to them, they take it into their protection, and when they carry a place by storm, they never plunder it, but put those only to the sword that oppose the rendering of it up, and make the rest of the garrison slaves. But for the other inhabitants, they do them no hurt. And if any of them had advised a surrender, they give them good rewards out of the estates of those that they condemn, and distribute the rest among their auxiliary troops, but they themselves take no share of the spoil. So here it's all very, again, utopian, in as much as you don't really have too often the luxury of deciding these things. Armies eat crops, supplies. There is a political end here. More wants to say essentially that the utopians are always so good. They got war for inflicting, let's say, some damage to the enemy that has to repay them in some way, but they don't do anything else right than that. Other than that, just not to be the bad guys, right? But in practice, politically and militarily and strategically, like, how do you think a war is going to be waged in the first place, right? If you don't actually carry out those means sometimes. Here, here in the way the population is treated, of course, there is a set of, let's say, whoever resists can be killed, the others, however, have been to be treated just perfectly. That's sometimes literally not something you want or you have the luxury of doing, right? If you need to pay the army, which is a problem, of course, that in Utopia does not happen. But some of the fiercest sacks out there were not just motivated by ideological hatred, but also by just the need of paying these troops that would have just needed to take everything, right, from these people. Of course, it's terrifying, but it makes you wonder, in the sense, what Moore really wanted to present as a solution, just per se, right? This is just an ideal, and he's very much about that. But then, right, wouldn't it be better to discuss? Because actually, for his own times, he says pretty developed things. And Moore is actually very famous author, character, thinker in general. So he spends himself here for depicting a reality that, here, for example, making the rest of the garrison slaves. What does it actually mean, right? We're not prisoners of war. Why slaves? Exactly, right? He who has advised the surrender is to be rewarded. Yes, in a political sense, of course, you must push people to break, right, and not to pose resistance. But with which resources would you do that in a war, right? It is that complicated in general. Right? So this is all pretty pretty just up in the air, I would say. In any case, when a war is ended, they do not oblige their friends to reimburse the expenses, right? Which also betrays that sense of, yes, of realism, at least, because, as we've seen, the Utopians always intervene for the Allies. They do not do it for greed, right? But who's the ally here? Who's the friend? It's not entirely clear as a general situation. You may intervene in favor of somebody in war, but doing it because of a pact of some sort, which can happen in the degrees of reasons why you intervene. Of course, if you intervene because you think that you're going to lose those forces you will spend in the enterprise, but you will get much more benefits later, well, go for it, right? Here it says, in general, you don't even have to envisage any situation, which instead happens all the time, for which you go to war but you want something in exchange, or broker some sort of deal there. But they obtain them of the conquered either in money, which they keep for the next occasion, or in lands out of which a constant revenue is to be paid to them. This is logical as far as at least the ideal behavior of the enemy there would have gone, right? The enemy basically just surrenders to these guys, and if they are so friend now that's what they have won, right, in the first place, from this community, and they can consider this as a bit of the reward. Bayman increases the revenue which they draw out from several countries on such occasion is now rising above 700,000 ducats a year. They send some of their own people to receive these revenues, who have orders to live magnificently and like princes, by which means they consume much of it upon the place, and either bring over the rest to Utopia or lend it to that nation in which it lies. This they most commonly do, unless some great occasion which falls out by very seldom should oblige them to call for it all. It is out of these lands that they assign rewards to such as they encourage to adventure on desperate attempts. If any prince that engages in war with them is making preparations for invading their country, they prevent it and make his country to the seat of the war. Right, this is also interesting. So, a preemptive war fundamentally, for they do not willingly suffer any war to break in upon their island. This is significant. We get back to the beginning, in the sense that, again, isolationism doesn't make any sense. If somebody's planning to invade you or to be dangerous in the first place, you just go for it and invade their land. If this is a useful thing to do. Right? Of course, here, according to the Utopian code, it must be a very moral thing, for which you will not invade somebody just by inventing that they have to invade you, right? Just to make recent references to countries that invade entire others because they essentially set up a fake exchange of fire, but nothing was really even happening in perspective. In the previous year, so at least it had rapidly gone down. So a Utopian would have never done that, right? Would have said what things really are, and not convinced the stupid people, of course, that they aren't. That whatever they do is okay, just by flipping history, reality, any kind of, just because. And that's the point, right? That's why the Utopians should be militarily aware in the first place, because you cannot fool a large amount of people into thinking that invading a country from a day to another is just the product of some thing you discovered yesterday suddenly, and that was allegedly threatening to invade your country, would put you in danger, when you were actually the country that had invaded that place and began to keep pouring troops in just to support essentially some mobsters that decided whether nothing really, because you were just using them as puppets since the beginning. In any case, here the sentence says, if any prince that engages in war with them is making preparations for invading their country, they prevent him and make, the thing for they do not willingly suffer any war to break in upon their land, and if that should happen, they would only defend themselves by their own people, but would not call for auxiliary troops to their assistance. And this, again, is this sort of honor idea that why wouldn't you call troops to their assistance? Because you have to prove you are the best of them all. You start becoming practically narcissistic about utopia, because, again, somebody may arrive. Yes, what more could come up with the idea that if you depend on others, they want something from you. You don't want them in your land even to help you, but realistically, in every war, that's what actually happens, right? So this is not a thing. I don't know about this video. For the sake of completion, I kind of make them, right? Some original ideas are very interesting. Others are a bit strange, or at least somehow notionistic and or a bit too idealistic and or impractical. In any case, there is a broader attempt here to draw an interesting picture regarding what a country should or shouldn't do. That it is sort of, again, so highly standard, let's say, people that you don't even have to, you have just to make wars for that specific purpose and not touching anything in the country you invade, or the sense, no, I don't get allies, I don't get any other troop inside my country if I'm attacked. Why? That would be one of the situations in which you would like to have them, because otherwise you would have already struck preemptively. And if you have that capacity, evidently it's because there is an enemy there that is matching you significantly, some sort. There may be lots of stuff going on, no doubt, but the sense is that, of course, this is Utopia, and this is such a hotly debated work that, of course, I'm no expert specifically on, but it definitely is a bit. The interesting thing about More is that not just he was killed for having, of course, kept supporting the Catholic cause, which is fascinating in this regard, because it's as if the Utopians were not so, again, this is the main criticism, the main, at least, problem there is with the interpretation of this work, is that not everything is written here is strictly Catholic and or just even Christian in a, or traditional in a broader sense. But of course, More would have himself killed for defending Catholicism, so much so that he's actually the patron of Catholic politicians still to this day, for the Catholic Church, and we surely can talk more about him on another occasion, but just for saying that this work is evidently motivated by some political ideas that are worth deepening, right? Especially in relation to the same work, like what did it mean again in the broader context? Was it just like in part a provocation? Is it in part ironic, aside from the mere satire of some passages, right? So we'll see this perhaps at some point, but I thought, again, it was interesting to talk about it every once in a while. There is always something new to learn, and we will keep talking about especially early 16th century, but even more like 16th century political ideology, because I think it's say, the more I've gone on, and I think one of the more enigmatic times actually in Western history, because we somehow gave for granted that this was just a basic sort of prosperity moment where there was nothing else to scope otherwise. Instead, again, it was one of the single most dramatic ones in Western history, but also one of probably, and accordingly, one of the most misunderstood, and one of those you may want to calibrate a bit more carefully in the judgment of, because I think a lot, but really a lot of what is simply say pointed out for this kind of content is not really that accurate. It's not really that significant, and or in the version that it is at least expressed today, right, or interpreted today. And this is surely something you wanna appreciate. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.